The storm. The evacuation alarm had been screaming for 6 minutes when navigator Thesavorn realized with cold, gut-dropping horror that the nursery pod was still sealed. She had been at her station on the upper deck when the ion storm hit, a wall of charged particles that the Ardent Crossing's long-range sensors had failed to detect until it was already swallowing them whole. The ship had no military-grade shielding. It was a cargo hauler, built for the long, slow runs between the outer systems, built for patience and endurance, not for surviving the kind of electromagnetic violence that was currently tearing through its secondary systems like fingers through wet paper. The first shockwave had knocked 3 crew members off their feet. The second had taken out the portside thermal relay and 2 of the 6 environmental control hubs. The third, and there had been a terrible, suspended moment of knowing a third was coming before it arrived, had triggered the emergency lockdown protocol across 11 of the ship's 14 internal sections. 11 sealed bulkheads, automatic, irreversible without manual override. Thesavorn had been reading the cascade of red indicators across her console, methodically calling out status updates to the bridge crew, when her eyes had landed on Section 7. Section 7, the nursery pod. Sealed. She had gone still in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. The noise around her, the alarms, the groaning of stressed hull plating, the shouted communications between decks had receded to a distant, meaningless roar. Her vision had narrowed to those 2 words on her display. Section 7, SEALED Lockdown Protocol Active. And beneath it, in the smaller diagnostic text that she had to lean forward to read, a secondary notation that had turned her blood to something cold and thin. Environmental Hub 4, offline, thermal cycling inactive. Estimated interior temperature deviation, degrees C and falling. Falling. She had been out of her chair before she had consciously decided to move. The Ardent Crossing was a Velhari cargo vessel, long, skeletal, and utterly unprepared for the ion storm that had come screaming out of the Kepler drift like something with a grudge. The ship lurched and groaned as its hull plating took the brunt of yet another shockwave, and the crew scrambled through corridors that flickered between light and terrifying darkness, between the steady hum of functional systems and the sickening silence of things that had stopped working. Emergency lighting strips ran along the lower edges of the walls, casting everything in a pale, sickly amber that made the familiar corridors of the ship look strange and wrong, like the inside of something dying. Thesavorn moved fast. She was not built for running. Velhari were long-limbed and graceful in low gravity, but the Ardent Crossing ran at standard humanoid gravity as a concession to its mixed crew, and at standard gravity Thesavorn's gait became an awkward, ground-eating lope that she had never quite made peace with. She moved anyway. She pushed past a pair of crew members wrestling with a fire suppression panel and ducked under a section of ceiling conduit that had torn partially loose and was hanging at head height, sparking intermittently with each new shudder from the storm. She was looking for Webb. Not because he was the closest, not because he was the most qualified technically, though he was, in fact, extraordinarily qualified. She was looking for him because in 11 months aboard the Ardent Crossing navigator Thesavorn had developed a very specific and carefully reasoned habit of looking for Marcus Webb whenever something was broken and the margin for error was 0. She found him at the junction of Corridor C and Corridor F, which was almost exactly where she expected to find him. The junction sat above the ship's primary mechanical routing system, and in any serious systems failure, Webb gravitated toward it the way water found low ground. He was crouched over an open panel in the floor, a handheld diagnostic tool in one hand and a length of bypass cable in the other, and he was working with the particular quality of focused stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of urgency. Thesavorn grabbed his arm. The tool clattered against the edge of the open panel. Webb looked up sharply, and for just a fraction of a second his expression was the uncomplicated startlement of a man pulled out of deep concentration, eyebrows raised, mouth slightly open, eyes not yet caught up with the rest of him. Then he saw her face and something shifted. He was on his feet before she spoke. "The hatchlings," she said. Her translator bead barely kept up with the desperate pitch of her voice, the words tumbling out of her faster than the small device could comfortably render them into the flat, functional standard that Webb understood. "The nursery pod, sealed during lockdown protocol. Environmental systems may have failed. Hub 4 is offline. Webb thermal cycling is inactive. The temperature is dropping and they are so small. They cannot regulate their own warmth yet. They are only 9 days hatched." She heard her own voice fraying at the edges and pressed on anyway, because there was no time for composure, and Webb, she knew, did not need composure from her. He needed information. If the heat cycling dropped even 2 degrees below optimal, if it has been falling since the lockdown triggered. She couldn't finish. The math was not complicated. The math was in fact devastatingly simple and she could not make herself say it out loud. Among Velhari, the hatchlings of a crew were the responsibility of all aboard. This was not sentiment. It was not merely tradition, though it was that too. It ran deeper than tradition, all the way down to something biological and ancient and absolute. The young of the crew were the young of the ship. Losing them was not just grief. It was a wound that had a specific name in the Velhari language, a word with no standard equivalent, a word that described the particular damage done to a community that had failed its most vulnerable. It was a wound that never fully closed. It left a scar in the social fabric of a crew that could be felt for years, sometimes for the rest of their lives. Thessivorn had seen it happen once long ago on a different ship, under different circumstances. She had no desire to see it again. Webb didn't ask questions. He didn't ask which corridor or how long the pod had been sealed or whether she was sure about the thermal readings. He had heard the word hatchlings and the word asterisk temperature and the phrase cannot regulate their own warmth, asterisk, and whatever calculation he ran in the space between one heartbeat and the next was apparently sufficient because he simply turned and ran. It was the thing about Webb that Thessivorn had catalogued early and returned to often. He did not waste time on questions when the situation had already answered them. Some crew members, faced with urgency, needed to talk their way through it, needed the reassurance of their own voice, the comfort of having articulated the problem before engaging with it. Webb was not like that. He processed fast and moved faster, and in a crisis the effect was something almost startling to witness. This large, quiet man suddenly in motion with a purpose so complete it seemed to displace the air around him. Thessivorn followed. Behind her came the hatchling's two parents. Orvash and Celindra had been on the bridge for the duration of the storm, Orvash at the navigation redundancy console, Celindra managing the communications array that kept sending out their distress beacon even as the storm kept eating the signal. They were good crew members, both of them. They had stayed at their posts. They had done what was required of them, and they had trusted, as the protocol dictated, that the ship's automated systems would keep their children safe. They had not known, until 30 seconds ago, when Thessivorn's voice had come through the intraship channel with a carefully controlled urgency that had not been controlled enough. They had not known that their three newly hatched young had been locked behind a sealed bulkhead for the past 40 minutes, in a room with failing life support, in a dropping temperature, alone. Celindra made a sound that had no translation. It was not a scream. It was not a cry. It was something below both of those things, something that came from a place in the body that existed before language, before thought, before any of the civilized layering that centuries of spacefaring culture had built over the top of whatever the Velhari had been before they reached for the stars. It was the sound of a parent imagining the worst, and imagining it in precise biological detail and being unable to stop. Orvash had gone silent in the opposite direction, so silent, so rigid, that he seemed to have become briefly something other than a living creature. He moved. He kept pace. But the expression on his face was the expression of someone who had already begun the work of preparing themselves for something unbearable, because preparation was the only thing left to do. Thessivorn heard both of them behind her and ran faster. The corridor to the nursery pod was dark in the way that only a corridor with completely failed lighting could be dark. Not the amber half-dark of the emergency strips, but actual darkness. A deep and total absence that the small strips along the floor barely dented. Section 7's power routing had clearly been among the casualties of the storm's second wave. The emergency strips here were running on backup cells, and the backup cells were old, and the light they threw was thin and wavering and deeply, profoundly inadequate. Webb didn't slow down. He navigated by memory and by the faint amber thread of the floor strips with the ease of someone who had spent 11 months learning every corridor of the ship by feel as much as by sight. Thessivorn knew he ran diagnostics on foot, sometimes physical walkthroughs of the mechanical routing sections, and that he had a habit of doing them in reduced lighting because, as he had once explained to her with characteristic brevity, you notice different things in the dark. She had filed that away as another entry in the long document she kept, mentally, labeled things about Webb that are useful to know. The door panel to the nursery pod had lost power entirely. Not dimmed, not flickering, simply dead. The small display screen that normally showed interior temperature and environmental status was black. The standard release mechanism, which required a powered panel, was non-functional. The door itself was sealed with the full mechanical weight of the lockdown protocol, which was designed to be resistant to exactly the kind of incidental pressure that a listing, shuttering ship might exert on an interior door. It was designed to be resistant. It was not designed to be impossible. Webb dropped to his knees in front of it without hesitation. He had a tool belt. He always had a tool belt. A battered, well-organized thing that Thessivorn had privately concluded was more a part of his anatomy than an accessory. and from it, he produced a flat prying tool in the same motion with which he located the manual release housing by touch. The housing was set into the wall beside the door, behind a small panel marked with the universal symbol for emergency manual override, and it was designed to be found in the dark by someone who had never seen this specific ship before in their life. Webb had seen this ship's manual override systems many times. His hands moved with the specific confidence of someone working from memory as much as from sight. He got the housing panel off in under 10 seconds. Inside was a recessed handle and a mechanical bypass lever, old technology, purely physical, requiring no power to operate. But the lever had to be set in a specific sequence, and the handle had to be turned against the resistance of the lockdown mechanism, and the lockdown mechanism was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was resist. Orvash pressed both of his upper hands flat against the sealed door. It was not a useful gesture. Thesavorn knew that. Orvash knew that. There was nothing his hands could do against 3 centimeters of reinforced composite and a fully engaged mechanical lock. But he pressed his hands against it anyway, and she understood why, because it was contact, because it was the closest he could get, because sometimes the body did things that the rational mind had no jurisdiction over, and the only honest response was to let it. He was listening. Thesavorn realized that a moment after she observed it. He was pressing his hands against the door and he was listening, the way Velhari parents listened, with the whole body oriented toward the source, trying, through vibration and proximity, and whatever biological sensitivity a parent developed for the specific frequency of their own young to hear something. Anything, any sign. His face told her nothing. Or rather, it told her everything, and everything was unbearable to look at, so she looked at Webb instead. Webb was working. He had the bypass lever engaged and was wrestling the handle through its rotation, his jaw set, his shoulders carrying the full mechanical argument between his strength and the resistance of the lock. The ship shuddered again, a long, rolling shudder this time, as if something structural had shifted rather than just flexed, and Webb's grip slipped just slightly and he caught it and held. "Come on," he muttered. He said it quietly, almost under his breath, the words directed not at any of them but at the door itself, at the mechanism, at whatever confluence of physics and circumstance was currently standing between him and the other side. It was the voice he used when he was talking to machines. Thesavorn had heard it before in the engine room and in the maintenance corridors, this low, half-addressed murmur that seemed less like speech and more like negotiation. As though the ship were a thing that could be reasoned with, persuaded, appealed to. "Come on." The handle completed its rotation, with a sound like something releasing a very long breath. The seal broke with a hiss of pressure equalizing, a sharp pneumatic sound that cut through the ambient noise of the storm-battered ship like a signal. The difference in air pressure between the sealed pod and the corridor was small but measurable, and for just a moment Thesavorn felt it against her face, a faint, cool exhalation from the other side. Cool. The air from inside the pod was cool. She felt Cylindra go rigid beside her. The door slid open. The darkness on the other side was complete, deeper than the corridor, total, the nursery pod's backup cells either depleted or never activated. For one terrible, suspended moment there was nothing to see. Just darkness and cool air and the soft sounds of a ship in distress. And in that moment, Thesavorn was aware of all 4 of them holding what they had collectively in the place where breath was supposed to be. Orvash made no sound, Cylindra made no sound, Thesavorn made no sound. Webb reached to his belt and produced a small handheld light, and clicked it on, and swept it across the interior of the nursery pod. What it illuminated stopped all 4 of them where they stood. Thesavorn processed it in pieces, the way the mind sometimes handled things that didn't immediately resolve into sense. The floor swept clean. The nesting baskets overturned or pushed aside. The far corner of the room, the shape there against the wall. The large shape and the much, much smaller shapes against it, and the movement, slow, rhythmic, unmistakable, of breathing. Multiple sets of breathing. All of them slow, all of them steady, all of them alive. She understood what she was seeing a full 3 seconds before she could make herself believe it. And in those 3 seconds she stood completely motionless in the doorway of the dark nursery pod, while the handheld light threw its small circle of illumination across the corner where Marcus Webb had apparently been sitting for the past 40 minutes. And her mind quietly, carefully, with great precision, took apart everything she thought she had understood about what it meant to share a ship with a human being. Marcus Webb was sitting on the floor in the far corner, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him at the relaxed angle of someone who had made a considered decision to be comfortable for a sustained period of time. His outer jacket was gone, she could see it spread on the floor beside him, laid flat, apparently having served some earlier purpose. He had unzipped his thermal undershirt all the way down the front and opened it wide across his chest, and all 3 of the hatchlings, each one no larger than a human hand, each one still soft-shelled and iridescent and impossibly fragile-looking, were nestled directly against his bare skin. He had arranged them with evident care, two side by side in the center of his chest, the third slightly lower, all three tucked into the warm hollow between his body and the thermal undershirt that he had folded loosely back over them, creating a small enclosed space that held his body heat around them like cupped hands hold water. His large hand rested across all three of them at once. The hand was not gripping, it was not restraining. It was simply there, broad and warm and still, a living ceiling over the sleeping young, maintaining contact without pressure, present without weight. He was humming. It was not a song. It had no structure, no melody that resolved into anything recognizable. It was simply a continuous low sound, a vibration that came from deep in his chest and resonated outward, filling the small room with a frequency that Thessivorn's own body registered as warmth even before her mind had categorized it. The sound moved through the air and through the floor, and she understood, through the bodies of the three hatchlings pressed against his skin. Vibration, warmth, continuous sound. The three things a Velhari hatchling needed, in its first weeks of life more than almost anything else. He had not been taught this. She was certain he had not been taught this. There was nothing in the standard cross-cultural orientation materials that covered Velhari hatchling developmental biology in any useful detail. She had read those materials herself and found them, as she found most standard orientation materials, adequate for avoiding obvious offense and useless for anything that actually mattered. He had looked at three cold, frightened, newly hatched creatures in a failing room, and he had understood what they needed, and he had given it to them. His eyes were half closed, he hadn't heard them come in. All three hatchlings were asleep. Their small, iridescent sides rose and fell in slow, perfect unison, each breath pressing them gently against the warmth of him and releasing. The faintest sound came from the smallest one, a trilling, subvocal sound so quiet Thessivorn almost missed it, a sound she had to identify twice before she trusted the identification. It was the sound Velhari hatchlings made only when they felt completely, unconditionally safe. Cylindra made a sound that had no translation. It was not the sound from before. It was nothing like the sound from before. It was its own thing entirely, and Thessivorn, who had heard most of the sounds a Velhari could make over the course of a long life, could not have named it. She was not sure it had a name. She was not sure it needed one. Orvash had gone very still in a completely different way than he had been still before. Before, his stillness had been the stillness of someone bracing against impact. This was something else. This was the stillness of someone standing in the presence of something that had exceeded the available vocabulary and choosing stillness because all the other options, words, movement, sound, seemed insufficient to the moment. Thessivorn stood between them and looked at the human in the corner of the dark room, with his thermal shirt open and his large hand spread gently across three sleeping lives that were not his, and she felt something shift in her understanding of things. Not dramatically, not with any great noise, but the way continental plates shifted. Slowly, massively, and with permanent consequence. Webb finally looked up. He registered their presence with tired eyes and a slight, careful shift of his shoulders, adjusting without disturbing, the unconscious competence of someone who had spent the last 40 minutes learning exactly how much he could move without waking the creatures asleep against him. "Hey," he said quietly. His voice was low, roughened slightly at the edges the way voices got when they had been used continuously for a long time at a register below their normal range. He had been humming for 40 minutes. His throat knew it. They were getting cold. He glanced down at the hatchlings, then back up at them. His expression was earnest and slightly uncertain, the expression of someone checking whether they had done the right thing and genuinely not sure of the answer. "I didn't know what else to do. I tried not to scare them." A brief pause. "I hope that was okay." Thessivorn opened her mouth. For possibly the first time in her adult life, nothing came out. Behind her, she heard Cylindra exhale a long, shaking sound, the sound of 40 minutes of held terror releasing all at once. And then Orvash made a sound that was very quiet and very specific and meant in Velhari approximately, "I am still here. We are still here. We are all still here." Webb looked between them, reading something in their faces that his standard apparently couldn't help him with. And after a moment, he simply nodded, once, slowly, as though whatever he was seeing was sufficient answer to his question. The storm continued to batter the asterisk Ardent crossing. The alarms continued to sound. Somewhere on the other side of the ship, someone was shouting about the port stabilizers, and somewhere else a secondary explosion bloomed and was immediately suppressed, and the work of keeping a damaged vessel alive went on and would continue going on until it was finished. None of the four people in the nursery pod moved for a long moment. They stood in the doorway and let themselves have it, the relief, the residual fear draining away, the strange and particular grace of a worst-case scenario that had not come to pass. And in the corner, Marcus Webb sat still against the wall with 3 sleeping hatchlings on his chest, and hummed and waited, and did not seem to find any of this remarkable at all. What they found. They had braced for stillness. Not the gentle stillness of sleep, not the soft, rhythmic stillness of small bodies rising and falling with breath. The other kind, the absolute kind. The kind that once witnessed never fully left the memory of the one who had witnessed it, the kind that installed itself in the architecture of a life and remained there, a permanent and unwelcome tenant, surfacing at odd moments and in quiet places for the rest of one's days. Thessivorn had seen that stillness once. She had been young, barely a decade out of training, serving on a science vessel called the Orvash Meridian that had run into navigational trouble in the outer belt of the Cassis system. The trouble had been minor, in the end reparable, survivable, the kind of incident that got written up in a report and then quietly filed and mostly forgotten. But the ship had carried a family among its crew, a bonded pair named Vurath and Vurath and Essen had carried hatchlings. And the hatchlings had been in a section that lost environmental control for 6 hours. Thessivorn had been part of the team that opened that section. She had been the one carrying the light. She did not permit herself to think about that in any detail. She had not permitted herself to think about it in any detail for 40 years. But the memory of it lived in her body rather than her mind, and her body remembered it now, remembered it in the way her hands had gone cold inside her gloves, in the way the muscles of her shoulders had contracted upward and inward, in the way her breathing had become shallow and careful, as though by breathing quietly enough she could somehow soften what she was about to see. That was what she had been carrying down the corridor. That specific memory, wordless and physical, pressing against the inside of her chest. And Orvash and Salindra had been carrying something worse. Because they were the parents. Velhari hatchlings were fragile in their first weeks, thin-shelled, barely mobile, dependent on sustained warmth and the low, resonant hum of their parents' chest song to keep their nervous systems regulated. This was not metaphor. This was not cultural sentiment dressed up as biology. The dependency was physiological and documented and absolute. In the first 3 weeks post-hatching, the Velhari nervous system was still completing its primary regulatory development, and that development required specific external inputs to proceed correctly. Warmth within a narrow optimal range, sound at a specific resonant frequency. Physical contact, skin or shell to skin, the transmission of another living body's presence, confirming in the most fundamental biological language that the world outside the egg was a world worth continuing to live in. Without those inputs, the nervous system did not regulate, the body temperature dropped, the metabolic processes slowed, and then with a quietness that was its own kind of cruelty, things simply stopped. It did not take long. That was the part that made it a Velhari word, a specific and terrible word, rather than just a sad thing that sometimes happened. It did not take long at all. So Orvash and Salindra had braced. They had been bracing since the moment Thessivorn's voice had come through the intraship channel. Since the words *nursery, pod and sealed and thermal cycling, inactive, had reached them through the noise and chaos of a ship in crisis, and rearranged every other priority they had into irrelevance. Since they had left their stations, simply stood up and left them in the middle of an active emergency, because there was nothing on those consoles more important than what they were now running toward, and followed Thessivorn and Webb through the amber-dark corridors of the Ardent crossing toward a door they did not know how to open. Salindra had her upper hands pressed to her face. She had done this partway down the last corridor and she had not moved them since. It was not quite covering her eyes. Her hands were pressed against the upper portion of her face, against her brow and the ridge above her primary eyes, which among Velhari was the gesture one made when one was preventing oneself from processing something too quickly, when one needed to be able to take in a thing at one's own pace rather than all at once. It was the gesture of someone who understood that what they were about to see might be something they would need to be careful about seeing, because some sights, taken in too fast, caused damage. Orvash was rigid. He had been rigid since the corridor. Every muscle in his body appeared to have reached a consensus to lock, to hold everything perfectly still, as though motion and grief were connected and stillness could forestall the latter. His face was the face of someone performing the internal calculus of worst-case scenarios, not because he was a pessimist, not because he had given up hope, but because he was a parent who loved his children with the specific and total love that parents had been developing for their young since long before his species had climbed down from wherever they had come from, and that love had a self-protective instinct that looked, from the outside, like despair but was actually the opposite. It was preparation. It was the mind doing whatever it could to soften a blow that might be coming, trying to reach the impact first so the impact could not ambush the heart. Every muscle locked, every breath measured, eyes forward because there was nothing to do now but see. Webb got the door opens. The hiss of pressure equalizing, the cool air, the dark. And then the light from Webb's handheld, sweeping the interior of the pod. What it found stopped all four of them in the doorway. Thesavorn processed it in pieces. The floor, the pushed-aside nesting baskets, the corner, the shape, the shapes, the breathing. Cylindra's hands dropped from her face. Marcus Webb had been in the nursery pod before the storm hit. They remembered now, all of them, with the slightly distant quality of information recalled from a context that no longer felt like the same timeline. He had been doing a routine inspection of the pod's thermal coupling. It had been on the maintenance schedule for 2 days, a minor job, the kind of thing that took perhaps 30 minutes and required no special equipment, and which Webb did, like most of his minor jobs, quietly and without announcement. He had been inside when the lockdown sealed. He had been trapped inside with the hatchlings for the entire 40 minutes. He was sitting on the floor in the far corner, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of him in a posture that was remarkably recognizable as comfortable, or rather, as the considered arrangement of a person who had understood that they would be sitting in one position for an extended and unknown period of time, and had made deliberate choices about how to do that sustainably. His spine was against the wall. His legs were extended rather than bent, which distributed his weight differently, reduced the muscle load, allowed stillness to be maintained without accumulating the kinds of tension that built into pain over 40 minutes of enforced immobility. He had thought about this. Thesavorn realized that slowly as her mind worked through what she was seeing. He had sat down against that wall with specific intentionality. He had arranged himself to last. His outer jacket was gone. She could see it on the floor to his left, spread flat, positioned against the wall at floor level in a way that took her a moment to interpret and then resolved into sense. He had used it to block the gap at the base of the wall where the thermal insulation was thinnest, where the cold of the outer hull bled most readily into the interior space. He had identified the greatest point of heat loss in the room and blocked it with his own clothing. His thermal undershirt was unzipped all the way down the front and opened fully across his chest. The fabric was pulled back into both sides, leaving his torso bare from collarbone to navel. And against his bare skin, nestled in the warm hollow of him, were all three of the hatchlings. Thesavorn had to look at this for several seconds before she could fully hold it. The hatchlings were each perhaps the length of a human forearm, each curled slightly, each soft-shelled in the way of the newly hatched. The adult Velhari shell was dense and impact-resistant. But in the first weeks of life it was still developing, still thin and translucent and yielding, iridescent in a way that the adult shell never quite was, catching the light from Webb's handheld and giving it back as color. They were fragile in a way that was visible. They were the kind of small that made a person want to hold their breath around them. Webb had arranged them with evident and careful thought. Two of them lay side by side in the center of his chest, each with their ventral side, the warmest side, the side with the highest density of temperature-sensitive nerve endings pressed directly against his skin. The third, the smallest, lay slightly lower, just below the sternum, curled tightly in a way that maximized the contact surface between its body and his. He had then taken the thermal undershirt and folded it back over the top of them, not wrapped, not bound, but folded, creating a loose tent of fabric that held his body heat in around them without restricting them, without pressure, without confinement. A pocket of warmth, a small human-heated chamber just large enough for three. His large hand rested across all of them at once. The hand covered nearly the full span of the arrangement. He was a large man, Webb, with hands that matched, and at this moment those hands were doing something that Thesavorn did not have an immediate word for. Not restraining, not gripping. The contact was too light for either of those words. The hand was simply present, broad and warm and unmoving, its weight distributed so gently that it seemed less like a hand resting on them and more like a hand offering itself to them, making itself available as surface and warmth without imposing. He was humming. The sound registered before she fully understood what it was. It came up through the floor and through the air simultaneously, a low vibration that was below the threshold of what most species would categorize as a tone, below the register of anything that would function as music. It was structureless. It had no melody, no rhythm, no pattern that her ear could locate. It was simply a continuous, unbroken sound, emanating from somewhere deep in his chest. From the sternum, she realized, from the bone itself resonating with the frequency he was producing, amplifying it outward and downward, conducting it directly into the bodies of the three small creatures pressed against him. She understood then, with a clarity that was almost physical in its impact, that he had done this deliberately. He had known, somehow through some combination of observation and instinct, and whatever quality of attention Webb brought to the living systems around him the same way he brought it to mechanical ones, he had understood that the hatchlings needed sound as much as they needed warmth. that the vibration of a living body was not incidental comfort but necessary input biological signal, the thing that told the developing nervous system that it was held and safe and not alone. He had not been taught this. There was no version of this information in any cross-species orientation document Thessivorn had ever read. It was not general knowledge. It was Velhari-specific developmental biology, the kind of detail that specialists knew and most others didn't, the kind of knowledge Webb would have had absolutely no reason to encounter in the course of an ordinary life. He had looked at 3 cold hatchlings in a failing room, and he had figured it out. His eyes were half closed. He had not heard them come in, or perhaps he had heard the door, heard the sounds of arrival, but had made the decision not to move, not to respond, not to disturb the sleeping young for anything short of certainty that it was safe to do so. The storm still murmured through the hull. The ambient noise of the ship in distress still filled the air. He had held his position through all of it. All 3 hatchlings were asleep. Thessivorn watched their sides rise and fall and felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was locked until the moment it released. The movement was slow and deep and completely synchronized. 3 separate small bodies breathing in the same rhythm, the rhythm of deep, secure sleep, the rhythm that indicated not merely unconsciousness but the specific neurological state of an organism that felt, at the level below thought or instinct, genuinely and entirely safe. The iridescence of their shells caught the light in slow pulses with each breath, each exhale pressing them fractionally more deeply against the warmth of him, each inhale lifting them fractionally away. A tiny and continuous exchange. The gentlest possible conversation between small living things and the large living thing that was keeping them alive. And then she heard it. From the smallest one, the one tucked just below Webb's sternum, the one curled most tightly, the one that had been the most distressed when hatched 9 days ago, slow to open, slow to feed, the one that Cylindra had sat up 3 nights watching with the focused, exhausted love of a parent who had decided quite simply that worry was the price of caring, and she would pay it without complaint. From that one, the smallest, came a sound so quiet that Thessivorn would not have heard it at all if everything else in the room had not been so profoundly still. A trill, subvocal barely there, a vibration more than a sound, the kind of sound that in a noisy room would have been indistinguishable from nothing. But the room was quiet, and she heard it, and she knew immediately and without any possibility of doubt what it was. It was the sound Velhari hatchlings made only when they felt completely unconditionally safe. Not merely warm, not merely comfortable. Safe in the specific sense of the word that meant I am held, I am known, I am not alone. Whatever is outside does not matter because I am here against this warmth inside this sound and nothing outside can reach me. It was the sound they made against their parents' chests, in the deep of a long night, when the chest song had been going long enough to settle them entirely. The smallest one was making it, against the chest of a human being from a different star. Cylindra made a sound. It was not the sound from before, not the sound from the corridor, not the one with no translation, not the one that had come from the place below language. This was a different sound entirely. Thessivorn did not try to name it. She was not sure it could be named or that naming it would have served any purpose. It was the sound of a parent who had been preparing for the worst and had been given instead this specific and improbable and extraordinary thing. This human in the corner of a dark room with her children asleep on his chest. And she made the sound that the body made when the worst did not happen, when the braced for blow did not land, when the space where grief was supposed to be found instead something that grief was not. Orvash could not speak. He stood in the doorway of that dark, battered little room, a room that smelled of recycled air and the faint metallic tang of a ship under stress. A room where the emergency lighting strips had failed entirely, and the only light was the small circle from Webb's handheld, and he watched. He watched a human being. A stranger from another star, hired for his hands and his technical knowledge contracted for mechanical systems work, paid a modest per-voyage rate that was reviewed annually and had been renewed twice without incident. A man who had been described in the crew assessment as reliable, skilled, uncommunicative in non-essential contexts, excellent safety record. He watched this man sit perfectly still on a cold metal floor for 40 minutes, giving warmth and sound and presence to 3 small lives that were not his, that he had no obligation to, that no one would have blamed him for failing to save when the resources available to him were only himself. He had not failed them. He had sat down against a wall and opened his shirt and put them against his skin, and he had hummed for 40 minutes into the dark, not knowing if anyone was coming, not knowing if the storm would pass or the ship would hold, not knowing if this would be enough or if he would sit here and hum and be warm and watch them fade anyway. He had done it because it was the thing to do, and he had understood that it was the thing to do, and he had done it without hesitation and without drama, and apparently without finding it remarkable. Orvash could not speak. The weight of what he was looking at had exceeded the capacity of language, which was not a feeling he had encountered often in his life, and which he did not know how to move through quickly. So he stood and he looked and he was silent. And somewhere in the silence he was doing something that was not thinking and not feeling but some combination of both. Some process that didn't have a name because it happened so rarely that no one had thought to name it. The process of understanding that a thing you believed about the universe was not complete, that there was more to it than you had known, and that the more was this. Webb looked up. The movement was slow and deliberate, the head lift of someone emerging from a state of deep focus, tracking back through layers of concentration to the surface. He looked toward the doorway. He looked at them. His eyes were tired, not distressed, not frightened, just tired in the particular way of someone who had been very still for a very long time while their mind worked, while their body served as instrument and resource and haven. He registered their presence. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like arrival. Like he had been waiting patiently for this specific moment, and here it was. "Hey," he said. His voice was quiet. Automatically quiet, the voice of someone who had spent 40 minutes not waking the sleeping and had not yet switched back out of that mode. It was also rougher than usual, slightly worn at the edges, the texture of a voice that had been working steadily at a task it didn't usually perform. He looked down at the hatchlings, then back up. They were getting cold. He said it with a simplicity that was so complete it functioned almost as its own kind of eloquence. Not I noticed they were getting cold and I performed an assessment and determined that intervention was warranted. Just, they were getting cold. The situation stated, the context that explained everything else. I didn't, he paused. His brow creased slightly, the expression of a man choosing words with care, not because he was uncertain of what he wanted to say, but because he wanted to say it accurately. I didn't know what else to do. Another pause. I hope that was okay. He looked between them again at Cylindra, at Orvash, at Thessivorn, trying to read something in their faces that his standard apparently could not help him with. His expression was earnest in a way that was almost difficult to look at. Genuinely uncertain, genuinely asking, not performing humility but actually experiencing it, actually needing to know whether he had done right. I tried not to scare them. The ship groaned around them. The storm had not finished. There were still alarms, still the distant sounds of a crew managing damage, still the work of keeping a battered vessel alive. All of it continued to be real and present and pressing. None of them moved. Thessivorn became aware slowly that she was going to need to say something, that someone was going to need to speak, and that it was probably going to be her, because Cylindra was still in the private country of a relief so large it hadn't finished arriving yet, and Orvash was somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary language, and Webb was waiting with the patient, uncomplicated honesty of a man who had asked a question and wanted an answer. She opened her mouth. She was, in 40 years of service, a woman who had never been short of words. She found for the first time she could remember that she had none. What she had instead was this, the image of Webb in the corner and the sleeping hatchlings on his chest and the smallest one trilling in its sleep, trilling the sound that meant asterisk safe, safe, completely safe against a heartbeat it had known for less than an hour, a heartbeat from the other side of the universe, a heartbeat that had sat down on a cold floor in the dark and decided without anyone asking, without any instruction or obligation or reward to be enough. She had no words for it. She stood in the doorway of the dark nursery pod, and she found that she did not need them. What was owed? The storm passed. It did not pass graciously. It did not taper or fade or give any particular warning of its own ending. It simply continued and continued and continued. And then at some point during the third hour it became less, and then lesser, and then it was gone, leaving behind it the particular silence of a space that had been very loud for a very long time and was now adjusting to the memory of quiet. The Ardent Crossing was still alive. This was not, given the preceding 3 hours, something that could be taken entirely for granted, and the crew understood it as such. The ship had hull microfractures along the port dorsal section. It had lost 2 of its 6 environmental hubs permanently and a third temporarily. Its navigation array was running at 60% and would require a specialist dock to restore fully. The secondary power routing had been rebuilt twice during the storm by a rotating team of 3, one of whom had been Webb, working alongside 2 Velhari engineers who had communicated with him almost entirely through gestures, and the shared language of people who understood machines well enough that words became supplementary. The Ardent Crossing had taken the storm and held, battered, listing slightly, running on patch systems and recalculated tolerances, but whole, but present, still moving through space with a crew intact inside it. It limped into stable orbit around the nearest charted body, a small, airless moon called in the navigational registry Castor 7 Minor, which had nothing to recommend it except that it was there and its gravity was reliable, and the crew set about the long work of repairs. This work was not glamorous. It was not the dramatic work of a crisis, but the steady, grinding work that came after a crisis. The work that was made of inventory and assessment and the careful triage of what could be fixed now and what would have to wait and what could not be fixed at all and would have to be worked around. It was the work of hands and tools and long hours and the specific kind of exhaustion that came from already being exhausted before you started. The crew did it. They did it because the ship needed it, and because they were crew, and because the alternative was not something any of them were interested in. The hatchlings were returned to their parents' care in the first hour after the storm, while the initial damage assessment was still being compiled. The ship's medic, a quiet, thorough Velhari woman named Osravath who had been practicing space medicine for longer than most of the crew had been alive, conducted a full examination of all three in the nursery pod, which had been restored to full environmental function as the absolute first priority of the repair effort, before the hull assessment, before the navigation array, before anything else. Thessivorn had issued that priority order herself, and no one had questioned it. Osravath's examination took 40 minutes. It was careful and complete and entirely silent except for the soft sounds of her instruments and the occasional very quiet sound from one hatchling or another, not distress. Just the small vocalizations of young creatures being gently handled, processed, returned to their baskets. When she was done, she straightened up and looked at Orvash and Selindra, who had been standing against the far wall of the nursery pod for the entire 40 minutes in the posture of people who were holding themselves very still by conscious effort. No temperature damage, she said, no developmental disruption, nervous system regulation within optimal parameters for their age, metabolic function normal. She paused, and then she said the last part with a precision that suggested she understood exactly how much it mattered. They are by every measure perfectly fine. Selindra sat down on the floor. Not dramatically, not a collapse, not a fall. Just a slow, deliberate lowering of herself until she was sitting, because standing no longer seemed necessary and the floor was as good a place as any to be when the last of something that had been wound very tightly finally unwound completely. She sat on the floor of the nursery pod with her upper hands over her face again, but differently this time. Not bracing, just covering. Orvash crouched beside her and put his hands on her shoulders and said nothing, because nothing was required. Osravath gathered her instruments without comment and left them to it. In the corridor outside, she passed Webb, who was heading toward the mechanical bay with a diagnostic kit under one arm and a length of replacement conduit over his shoulder, already in the mode of the next task. Osravath stopped him. "The hatchlings are unharmed," she told him. Webb looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, because he had been cautiously assuming this since Thessivorn told him the medic was with them, but something more than relief. Something that had been held in reserve pending confirmation and was now releasing. "Good," he said, "just that, then, that's good." "Yes," said Osravath. She regarded him for a moment with the slightly assessing quality she brought to all her observations. "It is very good, and it is good largely because of what you did." Webb looked at the floor. It was a reflex, clearly, the automatic downward redirect of a man who had learned to deal with directed attention by removing himself from its path. "I just sat with them," he said. "I kept them warm." "Yes," said Osravath again. And then she did something that Thessivorn, watching from down the corridor, had not expected. She reached out and touched the back of Webb's hand with 2 fingers, very briefly, in a gesture that was not the standard crew acknowledgement but something older and more specific. A gesture that in Velhari tradition was made between a healer and the person who had done the healer's work in the healer's absence. It meant, approximately, you kept them alive until I could reach them. "That is the same as saving them." Webb did not know what it meant. But he went still under it, the way he went still under things he was trying to understand, and he looked at Osravath's face and she gave him a single slow nod and then she walked away. He stood in the corridor for a moment, then he went to the mechanical bay. The crew heard about it in pieces, the way things spread on a small vessel, not through any announcement, not through any formal communication, but through the organic transmission of people who had been in the corridors, people who had seen the door opened, people who had heard Celindra's sound and needed to understand what had caused it. By the end of the first shift after the storm, everyone aboard the Ardent Crossing knew what had happened in the nursery pod. They came to find Webb in 2s and 3s over the course of the day. It was not organized. It was not planned. They simply came individually or in small groups to where he was working the mechanical bay, the portside routing junction, the crawl space above the engine room where he spent 2 hours replacing conduit that had burned through, and they did what Velhari did when they wanted to acknowledge something that exceeded ordinary thanks. They reached out and touched his arm or his shoulder or the back of his hand. Brief contact, deliberate, the specific pressure of the gesture of acknowledged debt, which meant in the Velhari vocabulary of touch, "I have seen what you did, I have recorded it. I carry it now as part of what I know about you, and what I know about you has changed." Webb received each of these with the visible discomfort of a man who would have preferred to be invisible. He did not rebuff them. He did not move away or deflect or make the small jokes that humans sometimes made when sincerity became too concentrated. He simply stopped what he was doing for the duration of the contact and held still. And when the hand withdrew, he gave a small nod that was, Thesavorn noted from her various vantage points throughout the day, always exactly the same nod. The same angle, the same duration, the same quality of acknowledgement that was also subtly a closing of the subject. He was gracious about it, he was also clearly hoping it would stop. It was Thesavorn who finally pressed him. In the late afternoon when she found him alone in the portside junction, and the work had reached a natural pause, and there was no obvious reason for either of them to be elsewhere. "You should know," she began, "that what Osravath did this morning." "I don't need," Webb started. "I'm not offering you comfort," she said, with the mildness she used when she was being precise. "I'm providing you with information. There is a difference, and I think you're capable of appreciating it." He closed his mouth, looked at her, waited. "The gesture Osravath used," she continued, "is very old. It is used between healers and the people who perform care in a healer's absence. It is not given casually. It is given when someone has done something that a trained professional could not do better." She paused. She was not being polite, Webb, she was being accurate. He looked at the wall. "I just sat there," he said. It was not deflection she had come to understand. It was his genuine assessment of the situation. He had sat there. That was, in his accounting, the complete description of what had occurred. The fact that sitting there had required understanding what the hatchlings needed, and providing it, and sustaining it for 40 minutes in a cold room in the dark, was not something his accounting system appeared to have a category for, because to him those things were simply the content of sitting there, not additional accomplishments on top of it. She regarded him for a long moment with all four of her eyes, the two primary eyes and the two secondary ones, which among Velhari opened fully only in moments of concentrated attention, and which humans found slightly disconcerting in a way she had long since stopped trying to moderate. "You understood what they needed," she said carefully, choosing each word the way one chose a tool for a delicate job, not the biggest word, not the most emphatic, but the right one. "Without being told, without being taught, you understood warmth and sound and stillness, and you gave all three for 40 minutes alone in the dark with no certainty that anyone would come." She let that sit for a moment. "Among my people, that is not nothing. That is not even close to nothing." Webb looked at the floor. Then he did the thing she had seen him do before when something had reached him that he didn't know how to hold, a slight movement of his shoulders upward and then down, a gesture that she had catalogued early in their acquaintance as the human expression of being in the presence of something one did not know how to accept. Not rejection. Not dismissal. Something more like, "I have received this and I don't know where to put it yet." She did not push further, she had said what was accurate, he would do with it what he did. She left him to his work. The evening brought a quieter ship. The most urgent repairs were addressed. The hull fractures were sealed. Environmental control was running on 4 hubs at reduced efficiency, which was adequate for the crew's needs and would be sufficient until they reached a station where the 2 dead hubs could be replaced. The navigation array had been coaxed to 63%, which Thesavorn had informed the crew was enough to get them home safely if they were patient about it. The crew ate, some of them slept. The Ardent Crossing held its orbit around the unremarkable moon and breathed. Webb was in the mechanical bay. He was almost always in the mechanical bay in the evening. It was the place on the ship that seemed most naturally his, the way some crew members were most themselves on the bridge or in the common area or in their own quarters. The mechanical bay was loud in a specific way, full of the sounds of working systems and the occasional complaints of systems that were working with reluctance, and it was almost always warm from the heat of the equipment, and Webb moved through it with the ease of long familiarity, the ease of a person in a place that asked nothing of them except competence, which was something he had in abundance and was comfortable giving. He had been there for perhaps 2 hours when Orvash appeared in the doorway. Orvash was not, in the ordinary course of things, someone who came to the mechanical bay in the evenings. His duties were navigation adjacent, and his off hours were typically spent with his family or with the small group of crew members he was closest to. He had no mechanical work outstanding. There was no professional reason for him to be standing in the doorway of the mechanical bay at this hour. He stood there quietly until Webb noticed him. Webb noticed him after perhaps 30 seconds, looked up from the secondary power coupling he was inspecting, registered Orvash's presence, and straightened slowly. He set down his tools. He waited with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he understood were important. Between them was the ordinary space of the mechanical bay, the ambient noise, the warm air, the slight smell of metal and electrical work. Between them also was everything that had happened that day, present without being spoken, the way significant things were present in the air between people who shared the knowledge of them. Orvash crossed the space. What he did next was not in Velhari culture a casual gesture. Thesavorn would have said this if she had been there. Osravath would have said it. Any Velhari aboard the ship would have said it immediately, would have understood what they were witnessing and understood the weight of it and stood very still out of respect for that weight, the way one stood still near something sacred. Orvash reached out and took Webb's right hand in both of his upper hands. The upper hands were the hands of precision among Velhari, the hands used for delicate work and for the care of young and for the specific and intentional gestures that carried the most meaning, as distinct from the lower hands, which were the hands of labor and navigation and the ordinary physical work of living. To take someone's hand in both upper hands was already significant. To do what Orvash did next was something else entirely. He lifted Webb's hand slowly and with complete deliberateness and pressed it to his own chest. Not to the sternum where contact was ordinary, not to the upper chest where a medical examination might listen for lung function. He pressed it to the specific point on the left side of his chest, slightly lower than the center, where the Velhari heart song resonated, the biological structure that produced the chest song, the low vibration that hatchlings needed and that adult Velhari used to communicate safety and presence and deep feeling to those they were bonded to. The most vulnerable point of Velhari anatomy, the point that was never exposed to a stranger without specific and deliberate meaning. He held Webb's hand there for 3 seconds. It was the gesture that meant, "You held what I cannot afford to lose, I will not forget. My life and my debt are yours to name." It was not a gesture given to colleagues. It was not given between crewmates, not even between close ones. It was given between Velhari who were bound to each other at the deepest level, or, in rare circumstances, from a Velhari to someone outside that circle who had done something that could not be repaid in ordinary currency, something that had crossed the threshold between what could be compensated and what simply had to be carried. Webb did not know exactly what it meant. Thesavorn knew this because she knew Webb, knew his baseline knowledge of Velhari custom, knew that he had done the standard orientation and absorbed what was useful and let the rest blur. He had not studied this. He would not have encountered this in any resource he had consulted. The gesture was too specific, too old, too tied to the interior of Velhari family and bonding life to appear in anything written for a general cross-cultural audience. He did not know what it meant, but he seemed to understand the weight of it. She had thought watching from the corridor where she had no particular reason to be and chose to be anyway, that he might pull away. That the intensity of it might activate the same discomfort that the crew's acknowledgments had activated, the same shoulder shrug reflex, the same deflection. She would not have blamed him. It was an intense thing in the ordinary space of the mechanical bay in the evening without warning. He did not pull away. He stood completely still. His hand remained where Orvash had placed it, against that point on Orvash's chest, and his face did the thing it did when he was processing something that exceeded his available vocabulary, the slight crease of the brow, the stillness that was not blankness but concentration, the quality of someone receiving information through a channel they had not used before and trying to understand it with full attention and full seriousness. The 3 seconds passed. Orvash lowered Webb's hand and released it and stepped back. And the moment, which had been outside ordinary time in the way that such moments sometimes were, returned to ordinary time. Webb looked at him, his face was very steady. Then he gave a small, slow nod. It was the same nod he had been giving all day, but it was not the same nod. The angle was the same, the duration was similar, but the quality was different, and Thesavorn watching could see the difference even if she could not have articulated it precisely. All day the nod had been a closing, a kind of gracious receipt and filing that ended the subject. This one was something else. This one was an opening. This one was the nod of someone who had been given something they intended to keep. Orvash held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned and left the mechanical bay without speaking, which was correct. The gesture had said everything, and speech after it would have been a diminishment. Webb stood alone in the warm mechanical bay for a while. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. It was Celindra who found the smallest hatchling. She had gone to the nursery pod for the late-night check. The check she did every night at this hour, had done every night since the hatchlings were born. A quiet routine of looking in on them in the dark and listening to them breathe and reassuring herself, as parents did, that they were still there and still fine. It was an irrational check in many ways. The nursery pod now had a fully functional environmental system and a secondary backup that Osravath had insisted on and Webb had installed that afternoon. There were monitoring sensors that would alert Celindra to any change in temperature or life sign readings before any change became dangerous. There was no practical need for a physical check. She did it anyway, she always would. She came into the nursery pod quietly, with the small light she carried for exactly this purpose, and swept it gently over the nesting baskets. 2 hatchlings, the first basket, Both occupants present, curled together in the specific arrangement they had developed in the days since hatching, the larger one curved around the smaller in a way that suggested even in sleep a kind of proprietary warmth. Cylindra watched their sides rise and fall for a moment, then moved to the second basket. Empty. She did not panic. She had been a parent for 9 days, and she had already learned the particular recalibration that new parenthood required. The shift from interpreting unexpected emptiness as emergency to interpreting it as information that required investigation before response. She moved the light carefully across the floor of the pod. The smallest hatchling was in the far corner. Not in distress. Not still in the terrible way that Cylindra's body would have recognized immediately and responded to with every alarm it possessed. Moving slightly with the slow micro-movements of deep sleep, a small shift of position, a curl slightly tighter, a breath that was slow and even and completely untroubled. It had crawled out of its nesting basket and crossed the floor of the nursery pod, a significant journey for a 9-day-old hatchling, a distance that represented real effort and real navigation, driven by something with enough force behind it to motivate that effort, and it was now pressed against the wall. Specifically, the wall on the port side of the nursery pod. The wall that, Cylindra knew because she knew this ship now the way she knew her own home, shared a partition with the mechanical bay. She stood over it for a long time. She stood and she looked at her smallest child, pressed against the metal wall of the nursery pod, seeking through the partition the specific warmth and specific vibration that it had learned in 40 minutes on a cold floor in the dark to recognize as safe. The frequency of a human heartbeat, the resonance of a human chest, the low, structureless hum of a man who had sat down against a wall and decided to be enough. 9 days old, and it had already mapped this, had already filed it under the category that the Velhari nervous system reserved for the things that meant *safe*, a category that was, in the first weeks of life, occupied almost exclusively by parents, by the specific signatures of the two bodies that had been present since before hatching, that the nervous system had learned to recognize before it learned anything else. The smallest one had added a third signature to that category. Cylindra looked at her child for a long time, then she looked at the wall. Then she set down her light and went to the mechanical bay. Webb looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He was sitting on the floor, an echo of how she had found him that morning that she registered without comment, with a piece of equipment disassembled around him in a careful arrangement that suggested he knew exactly where every piece was and would reassemble them in a specific order. He looked at her face and set down what he was holding. She told him in the careful pace standard that she used when she wanted to be certain she was understood. And she watched his face as she told him and saw the things move through it in sequence, first the processing, the taking in of information. Then something that was not quite surprise, but in the vicinity of it, the expression of a man encountering something he had not predicted. Then something slower and quieter and harder to name, something that settled into his expression and stayed. When she had finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he stood up and she stepped back from the doorway, and he crossed the corridor to the nursery pod and stood in the doorway of it with the small light she had left on the floor casting its dim circle. And he looked at the smallest hatchling pressed against the partition wall. He was still for a long time, long enough that Cylindra, watching him from the corridor, had time to observe the whole of it, the large man in the doorway of the small room, looking at the small sleeping thing that had navigated its way to the closest point it could reach to where he was, and the expression on his face, which was the expression of someone being shown something about themselves that they had not known was there to be shown. He did not speak. There was nothing adequate to say, and he seemed to understand this because he was, at his core, a man who did not use words when words were not the right instrument. He stood there for a while, then he turned and went back to the mechanical bay. Cylindra stayed in the corridor and listened. For a moment there was only the ambient sound of the ship, the soft working of its repaired systems, the hum of the environmental units, the distant and peaceful sounds of a vessel at rest in stable orbit. And then from the mechanical bay, low and continuous and resonant, with the specific frequency of a human chest in relaxed, sustained production. He hummed. Not a song, not a melody. Just the same sound he had made for 40 minutes in the dark, structureless and steady and warm, traveling through the air and through the wall and through the metal partition and into the nursery pod where the smallest hatchling lay sleeping. Cylindra stood in the corridor and listened to it for a long time. She did not have a word for what she felt. She had checked in the quiet of her own mind through the full vocabulary available to her in 3 languages, and none of them had the word for this specific thing, for the feeling of watching someone extend care past the point where care was required, past the point where anyone would have noticed its absence, because the thing that had received it once had imprinted on it and sought it out, and the person who had given it once was not the kind of person who could know that and do otherwise. The Velhari had a word for the debt that could not be repaid. She was beginning to think they needed a different word, not for the debt. For the person who, when told the debt existed, simply turned back to their work and paid it forward anyway quietly in the dark, to an audience of one small sleeping creature who would never know the word for what it had been given and did not need to. The hum continued. The smallest hatchling slept. The Ardent Crossing held its orbit around the unremarkable moon, and its crew rested in the aftermath of a storm they had survived, and somewhere in the warm air of a ship that was still learning what it meant to carry a human among its people, something had changed that would not change back.